Over the last 2 decades, unprecedented levels of job scarcity, inequality rates, wage stagnation, and refugee crises have afflicted our society. As a result, rates of depression and anxiety have skyrocketed. The collapse of society has been a backdrop for the modern mania of clean eating, self-care kits, yoga retreats, and the insistence that downward-facing dog is a radical political position. Hashtags of self-love, self-care, and putting yourself first make a prominent appearance in Instagram captions, reminding us that freedom looks like a thin, able-bodied woman undertaking a vacation. And we are constantly told that despite all evidence to the contrary, you can achieve anything if only you have a positive attitude. Presenting themselves as solutions to these problems, 2 parallel movements have emerged: self-care and self-help. I want to make clear that I'm not opposed to self-help and self-care inherently. The neoliberal versions of these subcultures is profoundly different from self-care and self-help rooted in radical political thought, and this distinction is incredibly important to make. I want to discuss today the ways in which these subcultures have become increasingly commercialized and corporatized and hijacked by capitalism to promote the idea that these are the mechanisms through which we can overcome the problems of capitalist society. After that, I want to discuss the ways in which we can begin to decolonize and challenge these subcultures and bring back the more radical conceptualizations of self-care and self-help. Part 1. Crafting the ideal worker. Capitalism benefits from productive workers. Without productive workers that accept working conditions and the unequal distribution of labor and wages, capitalism will not function. The self-help subculture is one way in which capitalism is able to produce productive workers, because within this subculture we're taught to fetishize work and overvalue productivity and achievement. We are supposed to utilize every minute of our time effectively, while just existing is lazy and wasteful. The mantra of no pain, no gain teaches us that you're not working hard enough unless you're in discomfort. Instead of promoting an intrinsic sense of self-worth, the self-help subculture teaches us to judge the worth of other people by what they produce and their achievements. Almost every self-help book teaches us to take 100% responsibility for our lives. So instead of blaming companies for precarious working conditions or austerity measures by our governments, we blame ourselves for feeling inadequate. The more inadequate we feel, the harder we work in order to relinquish this feeling. If we're burnt out, it's our own fault and we don't challenge the system or organization and nothing changes. Instead, we give up our free time to take on unpaid projects for our resumes, and we accept terrible 0-hour working conditions in order to succeed. And all of this naturally leads to insecurity over our work. Research from Harvard found that job recruiters deliberately set out to identify and recruit insecure overachievers, because as a result of their profound feelings of inadequacy, they're extremely self-motivated, self-disciplined, and hardworking, and consequently extremely attractive to organizations. So once again, self-help's focus on success and achievement helps manufacture a productive labor force. It's also become more and more common for companies to engage their workers through self-care benefits such as meditation and gyms. Companies have a vested interest in keeping overworked and stressed workers productive with things like positive thinking and meditation in order to ensure increased productivity. So instead of actually changing the conditions that lead to overstressed, overworked employees, these self-care measures help to numb the pain of precarious working conditions. And this can pacify us from doing things like unionizing and organizing in order to change working conditions. The values that are prescribed in self-help books are almost always relevant to market values, so that we can mold ourselves into a more desirable and marketable product. They demand us to continuously reinvent ourselves to keep up with the changing tasks of working life and increase our value so that we become more competent members of society. Rather than questioning and challenging the conditions within our society, we are taught to mold ourselves into people who are able to deal with these conditions. At uni, it was really common for my friends and I to feel as if we weren't really working if we were revising for subjects that we really enjoyed, because there was this feeling that work was supposed to require some form of discomfort. And this, of course, is very convenient for the people in power because we expect work to make us unhappy, so we don't complain about it. In my opinion, one of the most problematic elements of self-help is that it gives us a skewed idea of the type of things that we're supposed to value and find important in life. As free market economics is applied to everything, only successful artifacts and people are deemed worthwhile. We can easily see this through some of the titles of the most popular self-help books. Think and Grow Rich, Power, How to Get It, How to Use It, Looking Out for Number One, Swim with the Sharks Without Being Eaten Alive. The message is clear: be selfish, get money, get power. Through this, other values relating to kindness, compassion, and helping our neighbours are pushed to the sidelines because these things aren't considered real success. Goals are almost always self-centered. Get a house, get money, get a good job, get possessions. It frames life as a struggle and society as a competition. Each person is framed as an antagonist rather than part of a community. Some people have written about how self-help fosters a culture of narcissism because when you're absorbed in trying to achieve these goals, you don't do anything for other people unless it directly benefits yourself. The need for continuous productivity and self-improvement also can lead us to be completely dissatisfied with our lives. The constant constructions of taking responsibility, be a better you, take action, improve yourself, closes down the possibility that you're already satisfied with your life. Even if you don't want success, simply by not wanting it, you're considered deficient too. Since we constantly need to improve, we're constantly living in the future, waiting for the next success to fill the empty void within us. We're essentially a constantly failing subject. And teaching us to base our self-worth on external achievements instead of having an intrinsic sense of self-worth can have detrimental impacts. It can easily lead to heightened mental illness, rational disconnection, loneliness, and obsession with comparison. And the fact that we're made to feel as if we should be doing self-care and self-help continuously can easily lead to another form of guilt and stress. It can also be incredibly detrimental for people who can't be productive for reasons such as a mental illness or disability. And the unhappiness that comes from all this can easily lead to us engaging in self-care and self-help consumption activities. Part 2. Crafting the Ideal Consumer. Whilst these subcultures help create the ideal productive worker, they also help craft the ideal consumer citizen because they sell us the idea that consumption is self-help and self-care. Our capitalist system is based off of endless growth. It needs us to keep buying more and more stuff continuously in order to finance its continued existence. So, in our quest to improve ourselves and become a better version of ourselves and take care of ourselves, we are taught to keep consuming more in order to achieve this goal. Self-help and self-care has become an industry under capitalism, with thousands of coaches and gurus selling their services to teach you how to be better. Mantras such as treat yourself and you deserve it promotes splurging. Even something as anti-consumerist as mindfulness and meditation has been rebranded and used to peddle consumer products. Marketing schemes of global corporations sell self-help and self-care to make a profit. Coca-Cola convinces us to choose happiness. Kit Kats have a break, have a Kit Kat, tells us to treat ourselves. L'Oreal insists you're worth it. McDonald's tells us we deserve a break today. Despite the fact that millennials have less disposable income than baby boomers, they spend twice as much on self-care products, which means it culminates into a $10 billion industry. The products associated with self-care and self-help slots in neatly with capitalism by pacifying us because it sells us the idea that societal problems and our mental health is an individual problem. The solutions are completely divorced from systemic causes and can only be solved by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and spending money on self-care. One really good example of this is the way in which self-care and self-help reinforces misogynistic practices and oppressive ideas about female beauty onto women. Policing our bodies, appearance, age under the guise of self-care and spoiling yourself for the sake of making us more sexually appealing and attractive to men. Not only does this again promote more consumerism as we are coerced to buy more fashion, makeup, plastic surgery, etc., But the more people, especially people identifying as female, become distracted by and focus on their appearance and make physical and financial and emotional sacrifices in order to achieve this so-called beauty, the more important issues such as climate change, feminist issues, LGBTQ+ issues go unchallenged and become a lesser priority, and our ambitions in life reduce and the current state of the system goes unchallenged. Part 3. Crafting meritocratic and individualistic ideals. The core concepts of self-help and self-care ideas are intimately tied up with and help to reinforce and sustain the concept of meritocracy. This is because a central assumption in self-help is that anyone that works hard enough can succeed at anything, regardless of whether the odds are astronomical that it would happen. And if you don't believe this and you're not achieving success, self-help books teach us that it has nothing to do with inheritance, nepotism, or any other factors. It's simply that we're not driven enough, we're not trying hard enough, and we don't have the correct attitude. Self-help is also intimately tied up with individualism. Every single self-help book that I've ever read is adamant that 100% of responsibility for anything that happens in your life should be unceremoniously dumped on your shoulders. Words like take action, work on the self, take personal responsibility are littered throughout these books. If you are depressed, sick, exhausted, no matter how hard life is or has been, no matter where you start from, you should work on fixing your life yourself. And you have no one else to blame but yourself if you fail to achieve goals or make ends meet. The meritocratic and individualistic thinking inherent in self-help and self-care books helps to reinforce the status quo. It's deeply depoliticizing and prevents the type of collective action needed to create meaningful change in the world. It obscures the role of structural, historical, contextual, socio-economic, and political reasons for mental illness, the global economy, war, the dying planet, hunger, poor healthcare, xenophobia, and poverty. This has been called responsibilization or the privatization of responsibility, where our own well-being and the well-being of society is considered to be our own individual responsibility, rather than the responsibility of society to create structures that facilitate and ensure the health and well-being of people and society at large. Social influences are ignored, and we as individuals are rendered solely responsible for managing the problems in our lives. This can also lead us to ignore and legitimize inequalities because those who are poor deserve it and those who are rich earned it due to their merits. Never mind that Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, has enough money to buy every single homeless person in America a new house and still have $19.2 billion left over. It gets us to accept these hierarchies in the world without questioning them. It also can contribute to those of us with privileges to completely ignore the benefits we have gained from that privilege, and in failing to recognize our privileges, it's easy to perpetuate them. Meritocratic thinking can also foster a sense of entitlement among the rich. If the government tries to tax their wealth, they regard it as theft. And because we justify and rationalize and blame people for their poverty, mental illness, unemployment, people begin to reject more and more a welfare state model and social services, because if anyone is poor, it's their own fault. For example, meritocracy has been resuscitated by many right-wing politicians. Theresa May promised to make Britain the world's greatest meritocracy by reinstating grammar schools in the UK, and Trump justified his tighter immigration policies on the basis that it was apparently a merit-based system. If we believe the meritocracy inherent in self-help books, it's not difficult for us to make the jump to justify the unjust policies promoted by these politicians. This can also completely reshape how we view social ills, because if we believe that billionaires deserve their success, the implication is also that poor people starving deserve their starvation. We are taught we are responsible for our own misery and therefore deserve it, as opposed to recognizing we are obstructed by a system which benefits some at the expense of others. If anyone can succeed regardless of their circumstances, then clearly factors like race, gender, social structures, class don't have any impact on our ability to succeed. We are encouraged not to focus on changing the world and its systems, but instead to focus on changing ourselves. It prevents us from considering coming together to protest and organize or have any kind of broader collective solution to society's problems. In my opinion, the self-help and self-care subcultures have also served to de-radicalize the progressive ideals of social justice movements. This is because individual solutions as opposed to collective movements are considered to be the solutions to these inequalities. For example, people of colour are taught to rise to the top in their jobs. Women are taught to change themselves to better obtain their own needs. So these issues are completely divorced from the structures of patriarchal dominance or racial power or privilege. Self-help gurus often argue anecdotally, using examples of people who went from rags to riches. They hold these people up as examples, telling us that if they can make it and they came from nothing, then so can we. This can trivialize and invisibilize the very real inequalities experienced by marginalized groups. And maybe more importantly, as Mexi goes into in her video that I'll link below, it doesn't take into account that in a capitalist system, it's impossible for everyone to get rich and succeed. Capitalism relies on some people failing. The language of self-help books is also riddled with capitalist realism. Mark Fisher came up with the term capitalist realism to describe the idea that capitalism is the only viable economic and political system and there is no imaginable alternative. By encouraging us to think in terms of changing ourselves rather than changing the system, the self-help and self-care narratives can constrain our thoughts and actions from challenging capitalism. Others have referred to this as psychological colonization. Our hearts and minds have become so colonized by this narrative of meritocracy and individualism that we don't think an alternative to this system is possible. I think most of us recognize that a society in which Boris Johnson and Donald Trump hold the positions that they do isn't reflective of where the best and brightest have made it to the top through their hard work and personal responsibility. And I think most of us recognize that a system where 8 men have as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the world is unjust. And yet it's things like the self-help and self-care subcultures that help to legitimize meritocratic and individualistic thinking as powerful forces within our society. Part 4. Decolonizing self-help and self-care. Within these subcultures, we're given a very narrow, predefined, prescribed idea of what self-care and self-help looks like. I think we really need to begin to challenge these predefined ideas and recognize the fluidity of self-care and self-help, and that it isn't necessarily a linear process either. Self-care may consist of lighting candles, being relaxed and calm, or it may be about allowing yourself to feel the intensity of your grief, engaging in self-defense classes, engaging in mass protests. And self-help may look like working towards set goals of getting a job or a house, or it may be about disrupting the idea of a goal-orientated means to an end and just completely accepting ourselves as we are. How to be well and care for ourselves can differ between communities and people, so we need to decide what this means for ourselves. I think it's also about discarding this notion that there is a self that we need to get to and that our current selves aren't good enough. I think it's also important that we stop seeing our self-worth in terms of what is good for the market and training ourselves to cope with society, and instead try and bring about a society that can mold itself to our needs. It really frustrates me that there's a trend amongst leftists of a complete disavowal and rejection of any form of self-care and self-help, and a fetishization of despair. Because I think we're just going to be so much more effective at creating change if we're maintaining hope and our health and taking care of ourselves. And whilst I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the neoliberal versions of self-care and self-help, and that they can have some positive effects, for the most part I think they function to ameliorate the effects of capitalism. In other words, unemployment, poverty, climate change, austerity is not going to get better by us looking inwards and focusing on improving ourselves and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. This is because we're not talking about a self that is decoupled from political histories and present vulnerability and violence. Self-care and self-help in a world that denies certain selves care and help requires us to revolt against the inequitable distribution of suffering, well-being, employment, health, and other systems of oppression and exploitation. So we really need to historicize and politicize the self and the care. If we want a true transformation in societal health and well-being, we need to provide everyone with the means to live a healthy life with shelter, water, food, a stable employment, and a reduced work week. In other words, building community and collective care structures. In this way, self-help and self-care would no longer be ways to recover from societal ills, but they would be ends in themselves. As a result, I think a fundamental part of self-care and self-help is challenging our political, social, and economic situation. I think we also need to reclaim the forms of self-care and self-help rooted in radical political thought and activism. For example, self-care, Audre Lorde argued in the 1980s, was an act of political warfare against the neoliberal state. During this time, marginalized groups used putting themselves first as a deeply politicized form of self-care against a society attempting to devalue their bodies, pleasure, or very existence. And under our oppressive system, self-care can continue to serve this purpose today. Similarly, since self-help has been co-opted to become such an individualized thing that's all about how we can be successful, it can be a radical political act to ask ourselves how can we improve ourselves to become more compassionate, to acknowledge our privileges and fight against them, and to help out in our communities. As should be clear by now, I've argued that self-help and self-care have been co-opted by capitalist society to promote capitalist values and pacify us from creating change. But I think it's also really important to recognize that the co-optation of leftist concepts, ideas, and practices by the neoliberal project is pervasive throughout the entirety of our society. Feminism, empowerment, spirituality, climate change have all been co-opted in service of capitalism. And I've linked in the description box other people that I'd highly recommend checking out who discuss similar issues, including Thought Slime, PD Morin, Mad Blender, Pombabe Clem, Mexi, the Vegan Vanguard podcast. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to support my work, it would really help me out if you shared this video, liked it, subscribed, and you could consider becoming a Patreon. And I just want to say I'm incredibly grateful for all my Patreons, and thank you so much for anyone who likes and subscribes and shares my videos. It's really appreciated.